So for the stomach, I decided to split the stomach into two parts because as I was making this, I can see how I'm going to get long-winded, and you all know I can get long-winded. So I broke it up into two parts. So when it comes to the stomach, in the body, we're looking at the left side of the abdominal cavity, right? So we are in the upper left quadrant of the body. The digestive system throughout it has these thick rings of muscles, and they are extensions of that circular layer, and they thicken to form sphincters. And the sphincters are like the gatekeepers. They will open and close to allow things to move throughout the gastrointestinal tract. And so food will enter into the stomach through the lower esophageal sphincter. This is also commonly referred to as the cardiac sphincter. And food will leave through the stomach into the duodenum of the stomach by the pyloric sphincter. So the cardiac sphincter will separate the esophagus from the stomach, or I'm sorry, the lower esophageal sphincter. That sphincter has a third name too. It's also called the cardioesophageal sphincter. So I really am fine with all three, but to be honest, I think the cardiac sphincter is the easiest to remember. Plus, it's in the cardia region of the stomach, which we'll get into. Plus, it's by the heart. So I always refer to it as cardiac, but most people, especially at this college, refer to it as the lower esophageal sphincter. When it comes to the stomach, this is a J-shaped organ, and it can be divided into four major regions. I'm going to go over each of these structures using the picture, but I wanted to provide you something that you could print off or screenshot or look at in order to reference these structures. So looking at the cardiac region of the stomach, this is going to be like the first 3 centimeters, right? So when we're looking, let's orientate ourselves here. So here I have the diaphragm, and this is the esophagus, right? So get the first like 3 centimeters in the stomach is called the cardiac region. And then the top portion in this area, this top region of the stomach is called the fundus. The body is the main bulk of the stomach. And then we have this lower region, which is the pyloric portion. And the pyloric portion can be broken down into other parts. The atrium, think of like an atrium when you're going into a building. It's like the entryway. So you have like this little swelling here that forms the atrium, and then it narrows and starts to form the pyloric canal, and then it will further narrow, and you will see those muscles come together to form the pyloric sphincter. And then we have some curvatures of the stomach. We have this long curvature on the lateral portion of the stomach called the greater curvature. And then this medial curvature that's going to be closer to the heart, that is called the lesser curvature. And here we can see those same structures, but in a cadaver, we've got the esophagus here, and so we'll have the cardia region here. We got the fundus, that's this top portion, and then the body, and then we got the greater curvature, lesser curvature. Oh, I forgot on the last slide to mention the gastric rugae. These folds of the inner membrane are called rugae. And then you have the pyloric region, which will include the atrium, and then the pyloric canal, and then the sphincter. Here we have those portions highlighted for you to just kind of help you orientate yourself with the parts of the stomach. And one of the functions of the stomach is to mechanically break down food. We got to start taking that food we eat, we got to get it down to its original building blocks. So we're going to start to actually mechanically break up the food and liquefy it. And then we're going to add some chemicals. And so we will start, well, chemical digestion does begin in the mouth with amylase, but we will start the chemical digestion of proteins and fat. Amylase only breaks down carbohydrates in the mouth. So now, like that lipase that was secreted in the mouth is going to be activated to start breaking down some fat. And we will have some enzymes that can break down proteins. And we end up getting this soupy, pasty mixture of semi-digested food that we refer to now as chyme. Most digestion is going to occur after the chyme passes on into the small intestines. So the stomach has this outer slippery layer that's called the serosa, and then it's going to be followed by 3 layers of muscles. The most superficial layer of muscles called the longitudinal muscularis, and those fibers are going to go the long way around the stomach. And then the circular muscularis layer, that's going to go around the stomach like a circle. And then we're going to have the oblique muscularis, and these fibers are going to run diagonally along the stomach. And when these muscles contract, they're all going to contract in different directions. That will help churn the food and propel it towards the small intestines. And when we have this churning process in the stomach, it's referred to as maceration. So the innermost layers of the stomach, remember, are the submucosa and the mucosa. And that mucosa layer is going to start to fold, and those folds of the mucosa are referred to as rugae. And those rugae will stretch out when the stomach is full, and they actually contain mechanoreceptors that can detect stretch. So when the stomach's full and that rugae is being stretched and flattened, those mechanoreceptors detect that stretch and send the signal to your brain, hey, I'm getting pretty full. So the mucosa layer also has a lot of specialized cells within them. And these cells are called the mucus cells, the chief cells, and the parietal cells. These cells all secrete substances. The mucus cells will secrete mucus that protects the mucus, or not the mucus, the stomach lining. Our chief cells will secrete pepsinogen and a lipase. And that pepsinogen is an enzyme that's inactive. And when it gets activated, it will break down proteins. What's going to activate it is hydrochloric acid. That hydrochloric acid is secreted by parietal cells. And that hydrochloric acid, being very, very acidic, is going to also kill any microbes in your food or that somehow get into your gastrointestinal tract. So now we have this soupy mixture that's called chyme, and a mixture of all of these substances is referred to as gastric juices. And then we have another type of cell that is specialized in the stomach, the intestines, and in the pancreas, and they produce hormones. So if we orientate ourselves, we have a gastric gland here. And we're looking at some surface cells. So these cells are mucus cells. These are the guys secreting mucus that's going to protect the lining. right? As we go in deeper, we're going to start to find some parietal cells, and then we'll find some chief cells, and then deep in there, we'll find these enteroendocrine cells that are going to work to produce hormones. Those hormones will regulate digestion, food mobility, and intake, and they're also going to have some local effects. They'll have some paracrine effects. When we look at the histology of the stomach and we look at it underneath a microscope, we are going to see that there is a change from that stratified squamous epithelium to a simple columnar epithelium. That's going to cover most of that mucosa. The mucosa and the submucosa are flat when the stomach is full, but then they're going to form those longitudinal wrinkles called rugae when they're empty. Usually where we've seen so far, the muscularis external layer has 2 layers, but here in the stomach, we're going to have those 3 layers where we have the outer longitudinal muscles, and I like this picture better because it shows you those longitudinal fibers, the circular fibers, and then the oblique fibers. And here we have a cross section. So if we have like the lumen of the stomach, that would be here. We can see that the pit will branch into these glands. And so what's going to line these pits are those mucus cells, and this is in that mucosal layer. And then if we go deeper into that mucosal layer, we're going to find the parietal cells. They are going to be actively secreting some hydrochloric acid. And then deep in these pits is where we're going to find those enteroendocrine cells. We're going to find the chief cells located throughout this gastric pit. And then if we look at the submucosal layer that contains the lamina propria, we can see that we have all those blood vessels and nerves, and those that lamina propria is waving up and down into these gastric folds, going in like a wave and coming back out again. Here we have some histology of the stomach. You can see the lumen is highlighted here. And then if we continue to look at the mucosal layer of the stomach, that's going to include this layer right here. And the mucosal layer will have the epithelial layer, which is the more the deeper part that's connected to the lumen of the stomach. And then we'll have the lamina propria that has all those blood vessels. And then remember that mucosal layer is surrounded by a thin layer of muscles called the muscularis mucosa. And then we have the submucosa beneath that's going to be all that connective tissue. And deep to that, we're going to have the muscularis external layer. And in this layer, we're going to have the 3 layers of muscle. So if we look at the microscopic anatomy of the stomach, if we look at these gastric pits, they're kind of like wells or tubes that sink deep into the mucosa layer. And if we go along the surface, we're going to basically fall into these pits. Well, the glands within these pits are going to be a little bit differently depending on where in the stomach we are. Like the fundal glands will be different than the body glands, and this will be different from the pyloric glands. But if we look, these glands are lined with a simple columnar epithelium. And there's going to be 2 to 3 tubular glands that are open at each one of these, the bottoms of these gastric pits here that we can fall into. And so this is a magnification of the histology of the stomach. If we look right here, we have the lumen, and you can follow along and just really see how deep these gastric pits go. And then deeper to that are these glands, and you can follow those glands very, very deep to the muscularis layer. And so in these gastric glands, towards the surface, we're going to have those mucus cells. And then as we dive into or fall into that pit, we're going to have some mucus neck cells. And they're called that because they're concentrated at the neck of the gland. And then we're going to have in the upper half of the gland is where we're going to find those parietal cells. In this picture, they look like that little Pac-Man guy. These are the cells that are secreting hydrochloric acid and intrinsic factor, as well as a hormone that's a hunger hormone called gremlin. And I always, if you're old like me and maybe you grew up watching Gremlins, that's what it always reminded me of, the gremlin. It's secreted when you get hungry and you turn into an evil little gremlin. Anyways, the chief cells, these are going to be the most numerous, and they're going to be more in the lower half of the gastric glands. And these cells will not be found in the cardiac regions and the pyloric regions of the stomach. But these cells will secrete pepsinogen and lipase, gastric lipase. And then very deep, we have the G cells. These are the ones who regulate everything because they secrete hormones. So they're going to have a paracrine effect, and they're going to regulate digestion. And they are called enteroendocrine cells, right? So our G cells regulate digestion. And here we have another histology image. You can see that mucosa layer, and you can see those gastric pits, and then the gastric glands that lead to those gastric pits. And then we have the submucosa layer, and in between the submucosa and the mucosa layer, right in the deep part of the mucosa layer, you can see that thin layer of muscularis mucosa. And if we were to zoom in here, we can see two different types of cells. If you look at PC, that stands for parietal cell, and CC stands for chief cell. And the parietal cells are much larger, right? These are those Pac-Man guys. So these are those bigger cells. When it comes to the secretions of the stomach, your gastric juice is very, very acidic because there's a lot of hydrochloric acid in it. It has a pH of about 0.8, which is the same pH as battery acid, which battery acid is primarily sulfuric acid. There's about 2 to 3 liters of gastric juices that's produced by your glands a day. And it's mainly water, that hydrochloric acid, and some pepsin. So your parietal cells, remember that was that Pac-Man looking guy, he will combine water with carbon dioxide from the blood to form carbonic acid. And then carbonic acid will break down into bicarbonate ion and hydrogen ion. Bicarbonate ion is the HCO3. And that bicarbonate ion is going to return to the blood in exchange for chlorine. Chlorine will enter into the lumen with hydrogen, and the two will form hydrochloric acid. Of course, I have a picture for you next. So this is a nice diagram of the blood, that parietal cell, and then the lumen of the gastric gland. And it shows how carbon dioxide is taken in, and it's going to be converted to that HCO3, which is going to get pumped out in exchange for the chlorine, and then the chlorine plus the hydrogen is going to create hydrochloric acid, which is your stomach acid. And while we're here, I just want to pause and I want you to think about what role does active transport play in this process. You can pause the video also if you need more time to think about it. But it exchanges hydrogen for potassium. And the is from the hydrogen potassium ATPase. This is an active transport pump. And this diagram shows that hydrochloric acid will accumulate in the stomach while bicarbonate ions will accumulate in the blood, because bicarbonate is leaving the stomach. That blood that's leaving the stomach will have a higher pH when digestion is occurring than when the stomach is empty. So the high pH of blood washing away from the stomach is actually something called alkaline tide. So when this hydrochloric acid is produced, it's going to activate pepsin. It will start cutting up pepsinogen and lingual lipase. When it cuts up pepsinogen, it basically cuts off and removes some amino acids, and that makes it so that this enzyme can start breaking down proteins. It'll do the same thing to lingual lipase, which is produced in the mouth. It'll start activating that so fats can be broken down. Hydrochloric acid is also going to break up the connective tissue of plant cell walls, and it's going to help liquefy food, form that chyme. And then if we ingest any ferric ions, so like if you eat red meat, that ferric ions will get converted to ferrous, and ferrous can then be absorbed and used for hemoglobin synthesis. So hydrochloric acid can also contribute to nonspecific disease resistance because it will destroy a lot of ingested pathogens. So there's a lot of innate immunity by this hydrochloric acid. So zymogens are enzymes, digestive enzymes, that are secreted and they're not active. They don't work yet. So they have to be converted or activated by something. And usually that's done by removing some of the amino acids that make up this protein. So for example, pepsinogen. Pepsinogen is a zymogen secreted by chief cells. And when it's in the presence of hydrochloric acid, some amino acids will get removed and it will form pepsin. Well, that pepsin can now digest proteins. And so that's why in this picture you can see that some of the amino acids or peptides have been removed, but not all of them. And so pepsin will take proteins and it will cut them up into smaller peptides. And then the rest of protein digestion is going to be finished in the small intestines. We have lingual lipase that was produced in the mouth. And then we have chief cells that will also produce gastric lipase. Both of those lipases play a minor role in the digestion or digesting dietary fats. ACE, anything that ends in ASE means it's an enzyme that's going to break something down. Lipo means fat. Okay, so about 10 to 15% of dietary fats will be digested in the stomach, and then the rest is going to happen in the small intestines. And then we have intrinsic factor. This is a glycoprotein. Remember, glyco means sugar, protein is a protein. So this is a sugar protein molecule that is made by parietal cells. And this intrinsic factor is vital to absorb vitamin B12 in the small intestines. Intrinsic factor will bind to vitamin B12, and then that complex will be able to be absorbed by cells in the intestines via receptor-mediated endocytosis. And we talked about megoblastic anemia, which can form from a lack of vitamin B12. So this is where I'm going to pause it because now we're at like 25 minutes. And we will continue and finish the stomach in the next video.